Hello, the webinar for today will begin shortly. Hello, and welcome to the first of a six-part course of study for the in-house practitioner, Introduction to Information Governance. This is a first of a series of webinars where we're going to walk through and discuss and have a class around what is information governance and how do you implement it, and what does a program like this do? A whole series of six. We have a fairly large audience today, but I still want to encourage everybody to be able to ask some questions. And today we're going to talk a little bit about what is information governance and an introduction to that. And I'm going to classify the audience sort of two different members. We may have some people that are quite frankly very new to the world of information governance. Maybe you've heard the term information governance. Maybe you sort of understand it, maybe not. But we're going to talk about and talk to that group. What does information governance do, and how do organizations approach it, and what's involved? And there may be a second group of experienced practitioners, and for them we're going to really talk about how you explain information governance to other stakeholders. If you've got other groups of people that you want to engage and involve, what have we found are some of the best definitions that organizations can use, and how do you take this seemingly complex and seemingly esoteric topic around information governance and explain it? Again, I do want to encourage people to ask questions. I want to make this as much of a class format, and we're going to endeavor to drive down and discuss a lot of different areas associated with information governance. My name's Mark Diamond. I'm going to be the first of the faculty members, but all the other webinars, we're going to have other of our control team of experts be able to present that, and we'll be able to talk a little bit about that. So let's just talk about what we hope to be able to achieve today. And one is talk about the challenges of today's runaway information management environments, and many of us are familiar with different parts of those, but oftentimes there are some elements of this that within our area that we may not be aware of or be able to succinctly describe all of them. Next one is very important. I want to be able to talk about information governance in very plain spoken terms. Too often people talk about this in sort of officialese or legalese or quite frankly some level of gobbledygook, and I don't think that helps programs very much. It certainly is not very effective in terms of launching a type of program. What are the main drivers associated with IG? What are the typical activities of an information governance program? And identify areas of compliance, cost savings, and business benefits of these programs. And you'll notice I use the term IG, which is obviously an acronym for information governance. I tend to want to use the larger term information governance because Although, again, a lot of practitioners know IG, but it's easy to slip into that and talk to somebody who doesn't know, and they won't know what you're talking about. So we're going to try and talk about information governance overall. Again, a really great audience today. A lot of in-house practitioners talk about this. So before we talk about what information governance is, let's take a step back and talk about what's happening. What are some of the macro trends in our information environment? And again, these trends are going to be a surprise to nobody. But the first one is paper usage out there is really decreasing fairly significantly. The paper usage pounds per white-collar employee, and it used to be that we used a lot of office paper. These days, we don't really use much office paper. For example, have a tablet. I almost never have paper, and I almost always request stuff electronically. And we're seeing that in terms of the amount of paper used. By the way, this statistic applies not only for North America, but also for Europe and South America. These are generally overall trends. There's some areas of the world that still tend to be more paper-centric than others, but the overall trend is in the same direction, which is down, down, down. Now, if we look at the amount of data that we have, it's the opposite. It's up, up, up. And when we talk about data, there's different types of data. Sometimes we talk about structured data, and structured data is a way of talking about data that lives in database. This next graph is unstructured data, and that's sort of a fancy way of talking about loose data. And that may be files, maybe that's documents, maybe that's images, that's data that lives unto itself. Like if I have a file, it's not necessarily sitting on my laptop, it's not connected to anything. We call that unstructured data, and the amount of unstructured data has just grown tremendously, and it continues to grow. Matter of fact, within organizations, unstructured data is one of the largest single areas of data growth we see out there. But it's not only unstructured data, we're also seeing email, and we call email semi-structured data. Again, a fancy term, and we call it semi because it's sort of structured like you can have different emails in a thread. There's some metadata relating different threads within an email or into a server or other information associated with that. But you can also save an email by itself and have it printed out by itself. That's why we call it semi-structured. And so obviously email is increasing very significantly. And then just what's interesting is if we look at the amount of information with value or under legal hold out there, that's a big chunk of it, but an even larger chunk of data, and this is an example of a 5,000 person company, maybe 3/4 of the documents or data are old or expired or unneeded or a record that we don't have to keep anymore, or a copy of something. And so we're becoming more digital. We're having more information out there, but we're also getting a lot more junk that comes with it. And all these trends together are sort of conspiring to impact how organizations handle information. And one of the first areas that comes to fore is sort of the compliance risks. And if we look at what the regulators are saying, and this is true not only in the United States, quite frankly on a worldwide basis, increasingly, the regulators have rules, or the governments have rules that say, you need to keep this document or this, we're going to classify this as a record, and we need to keep it for a particular period of time. And when organizations don't do that, they don't save the right stuff, or they delete it, or they don't save it long enough, or they can't find it when they need to, bad things can happen. And so we're seeing data increase, but we're also seeing a significant increase in the amount of regulatory action on behalf of regulators. And some of these are sort of specific, industry specific, FINRA. FINRA is the Financial Regulatory Authority in the US. There are similar regulatory authorities in Europe and Canada and other places like that. But they've been on a spree the last couple of years in terms of finding organizations. Sometimes it's a find a specific incident, or maybe it's something that they really didn't do anything wrong, but somebody claims, hey, they didn't save the right records, and just trying to prove that you didn't do anything wrong because you get so much documents and data out there tends to be a huge issue for organizations. And so we're seeing these compliance risks increase over time. Okay, so we're going to add up the trends. We talked about there's more stuff out there. There's more documents and data. We're seeing the regulatory risks increase out there. And one of the big issues we also have is around e-discovery in the U.S. and to some extent in Canada and other venues out there. When organizations face either a lawsuit or they face some type of regulatory action, they have a duty to be able to preserve this information. In other words, don't delete it. And once they preserve it, they have to be able to see, okay, of the data I have saved in a lawsuit, which of this information is going to be responsive? In other words, the other party have to show them documents relating to the matter or the lawsuit specifically. Or if a regulator comes in, a regulator will say, show me everything about this particular issue. I have to be able to produce that information for them. And this can be a very time-consuming process. It can be a very expensive process. 50% of the cost of litigation is typically just this discovery process. And then finally, if you get it wrong, some really bad things can happen to you. You can face sanctions by the courts. You can face fines by the regulators. You can actually lose the lawsuit just on the fact that you couldn't find the information that you were supposed to have to be able to produce, or you didn't produce it fast enough. They can give you adverse inference or even a judgment against you based on your inability to find stuff. So again, let's add this up. We get more documents and more data out there, sort of spread all over the place. And in certain situations, in litigation or regulatory inquiry, we have to be able to find it very quickly. By the way, we talk a lot about privacy. The same issue exists in privacy to some extent, although for a different reason. If you have European customers right now, you may have to find their privacy data and show them what you have. We'll talk about this soon. Have to soon do this in California for California consumers too. And if they want, you have to be able to delete it. That's a lot like e-discovery. It gets some aspects of e-discovery in the sense that you have to be able to identify what information you have. Again, and that's getting more and more difficult as we have this huge morass of documents and data out there. And so that's causing a problem. We talked about the European General Data Protection Regulation. You have to be able to find these. But it's not just there, because organizations not only have privacy data out there, in other words, they have data about individuals or consumers, sometimes they have intellectual property. If you're a company and you make stuff, or maybe you're a research organization, or maybe you develop drugs, or maybe you develop electronic devices, nearly all organizations have some level of intellectual property. If you've got a lot of it all over the place and it's not controlled, somebody can come in and take your intellectual property. This, at least in North America, is a huge concern among a lot of organizations that we work with. They're saying, hey, we got the corporate crown jewels here. We got to be able to protect them. And by the way, oftentimes this intellectual property doesn't exist, in a single folder. The IP does not exist in one notebook or in one file share or one folder. Oftentimes, intellectual property, and the way organizations work today and they invent stuff and innovate, tends to be an email here, a file there, this there, something in a wiki. I mean, these things all add up, and in the collection, they represent a huge amount of intellectual property, as well as, quite frankly, trade secrets associated with that. Another one of this is that sometimes you've got all this sensitive information, and maybe it's just employees' personal information. Maybe it is, if not intellectual property, maybe it's a business secret. Maybe it's something that you were negotiating a contract with them. You had the terms, and maybe you're negotiating a contract with somebody else, giving them different terms. And if that second group found out what you're negotiating in the first group, it would be hurtful to you as an organization. That is very proprietary and confidential information. Again, the same issue, and we found this in the Sony hack, when Sony Pictures was hacked, is that they had all this confidential information really spread all over the place, and it was relatively easy for somebody to come in, and recent news still thinks it may be North Korea, although a lot of my security friends doubt that, but or other places. So we have these sensitive information collected out there, or finally, sometimes there's specialized sensitive information like healthcare information. There's a regulation called HIPAA, and HIPAA requires you to be able to secure healthcare information about individuals. And if you don't secure it, well, you can pay some significant fines. Now, it's interesting. We're sort of talking about seemingly very different things. We're talking about European privacy requirements. We're talking about protecting IP. We're talking about saving trade secrets, or we're talking about complying with HIPAA regulations for healthcare. And by the way, you don't only have to be an insurance carrier or a healthcare provider to have healthcare information. Most employees have some level of HIPAA. Most employees have some level of HIPAA about their employees. If you have benefits, there's going to be a part of that which is sensitive information. And again, this stuff sort of all spread out, and it's becoming an issue for organizations. And we're making the problem sort of expanding. We're getting more out there to be able to do that. So along comes this thing called information governance, and information governance is really this idea saying we've talked about too much data all over the place. We've talked about records management. We've talked about litigation readiness. We've talked about control of sensitive privacy information. So there's a whole industry saying, you know what? These are not necessarily different things. They're all about how do we manage, save, secure, give access to, and or destroy documents or data. I mean, they're for different drivers, for different reasons, but a lot of times the actions are the same. And so many organizations today are beginning to say, wow, maybe I shouldn't have a separate privacy program, or wow, maybe I shouldn't have a separate records program or separate e-discovery program. Maybe I could begin, if not having the same program, I could have some of these functions are shared functions, or some of the efforts could be shared, and it would just be easier because I would be doing one thing for multiple drivers. So we come up with the term of information governance. And I'll talk about information governance in a second, but I think I want to detour a little bit for the class and talk about a very important point. And that is, how do we define information governance? And this is a very slippery slope. And so there are some terms out here, So Gartner Group has a definition of information called the Specification, Decisions, and Rights Accountability Framework to ensure appropriate behavior and evaluation, creation, storage, use, archiving, deletion of information. There's more, you can read the rest of it. Or ARMA's got a term around information governance, the Strategic Framework of Standards, Processes, Roles, and Metrics. Sedona Conference has a definition of information governance out there. Coordinated interdisciplinary approach. Or CGOC, the management of information out there, or, a framework to ensure information integrity is another one. Why am I flagging this as a potential pitfall? Well, what's going on here? Why do we have all these different definitions associated with information? Well, because everybody wants to be in information governance. We created the official definition of information governance. So a lot of these organizations are competing to have the standard definition of information governance. But there's another problem with that. And sometimes we see practitioners that come out and say, hey, I need to give an official definition to my boss, or I need to go to the executive committee and show them an official definition. And the problem is, if you go to your chief information officer or your general counsel or your chief financial officer or even your CEO, and you say, we want to do a program that is the specification of decision and rights and accountability framework to ensure appropriate behavior and evaluation, creation, storage, use, and archiving and deletion of information, he or she, your CEO, may go, huh? What do you mean? Somehow we've gotten on this sort of definition binge, and to be honest, in my experience, I don't really find these definitions terribly useful. The other thing that happens sometimes is we see in an organization, somebody wants, when they're starting an information governance program, thinks if they can define a definition, they will define ownership of a larger group. Well, we as a company defined it this way, and I'm doing it, therefore I own all this. And I want to say careful. I haven't seen that to be very successful. Fine. If you're doing a white paper and you want to throw in a definition, fine, throw in a definition. Rarely have we seen that these definitions are used in actual organizations that are looking to get buy-in for one of these programs. And we think there's a risk out there. And by the way, if you talk to the industry, everybody's going to want to give you another official definition. And you really have to find one that works for you and that you put together. Just a word of confidence. So when we talk about information governance, I like to keep it simple. These can be complicated enough, and anytime you've got a sophisticated program, all the more important talking about information governance is you keep the definition fairly simple. And so we talk about information governance being a combination of 5 different things. One is legal and compliance. There are rules out there for record retention. We have to follow the rules out record retention, and those could be, local, those could be state, those could be federal, those could be international, they could be industry specific, they could be general, they could, lots of different types of rules out there. And so we create information, and we're bound by those legal and compliance rules to create, to be able to retain documents for a certain period of time. I'm going to bounce it around a little bit. Another one is securing intellectual property or confidential privacy information. And you can add deleting that too, for that matter. And so we alluded to, we have different types of intellectual property. We have privacy information. We have information about consumers. Sometimes we have medical information. We want a way to be able to make sure we can secure that information and then dispose of it appropriately. And so we see IG as a combination of records management and managing sensitive information. We look at it as a combination of optimized discovery. So if and when you have either litigation or if you don't have a lot of litigation, if you have, a regulator comes in and says, I want to see this, how efficiently and effectively are you going to do that? Are you going to do it quickly? Can you find out? Is it going to be easy, or is it going to be difficult, risky, and expensive? We're going to say in our definition of information governance, it's a litigation readiness. It's can we be smarter? So if and when litigation happens, we can really be better prepared for it. And by the way, the key there is before litigation happens. What are the steps that we can take beforehand, before something happens, so if and when it does happen, we're well prepared. Part of what we define as an information governance program is defensible disposition. Can we get rid of the stuff that we don't need? And I alluded to earlier, as much as 3/4 of the data, the documents, the offsite paper is stuff that we don't really need to keep, and it's creating not only cost because we got to spend either data storage dollars or physical storage dollars to be able to keep it, but it's also something we quite frankly, it's risky to have because we may have to search through all this junk, sometimes called rot, redundant, obsolete, and trivial data to be able to get rid of. And that could be expensive too. And people often don't look at the fact that if we ever have to get sued and we have all this extra unneeded rot all over the place, that could be very, very expensive for us to be able to do that. And the final area that we think is a huge driver of information governance is productivity and collaboration. And you may not think that, on one hand, we may be on a tear, and we've seen this in a lot of organizations where they want to go out and saying, hey, let's get rid of we got sued, a huge amount of money in discovery, we realized that we have lots of electronic junk out there, lots of rot, lots of unneeded paper, let's go delete stuff, which is good. And some people sometimes say, well, the employees want to save this. In reality, no. We find that a good information governance program can do both. It not only gets rid of the stuff we don't need, but it helps identify the high-value information to make employees more productive and more collaborative. So, again, it's really straightforward. And by the way, notice in this definition, we talk about legal and compliance, disposition, and sensitive information, and litigation readiness, and productivity and collaboration. We described it without using a whole lot of very fancy words. I'm not trying to use a bunch of legalese. I'm not trying to get very technical. And again, we find when we describe these programs this way, they tend to be much more useful, much more easy for organizations to understand. But the important point also remember is, again, we can do a single task or multiple tasks that serve these multiple masters. And that's where organizations are beginning smart. They're saying, oh, if we do disposition, well, that's going to help our litigation readiness. That's going to reduce cost and risk. If we do good records management and classification out there, well, that could help us in our privacy. So what we find out there is these things are very much interrelated, and that's why increasingly organizations are starting these information governance programs if they can figure out how to address it. Now we have a good question here. Does IG also include database structures, enterprise data dictionary, data warehouses, or is it more focused on end user records? That's actually a good one, and that's a topic we're going to bring up in the advanced series that we're going to come up with next semester, but I'm going to give an advanced topic. We look at information governance as being different than the world of data governance. So, and I'm going to try and cut hairs a little bit. Information governance does include the management of structured data in databases. That's data that lives in structured is data that lives in databases. Information governance, there are records retention requirements and disposition strategies for getting rid of structured data, and there's obviously privacy requirements for that too. But there's also a whole other field out there that's called data governance, and we look at information governance as being separate from data governance, and we actually see information governance complementing data governance. And data governance is about master data management, it's about big data, it's about collecting all different types of data from multiple databases and multiple sources to be able to answer big questions, which is valuable, but we position that as a separate activity. And most organizations we talk to position information governance as a separate than data governance. But it's a good question because it's a very confusing point. And if you're interested, email us. We actually have a webinar on our website. If you don't want to wait until next semester, we have a webinar on our website that talks about the difference between information governance and data governance. But that's a really good question. We appreciate that. All right. So who runs these information governance programs? There's one idea that you're going to have a single person, a chief information governance officer run and if anybody's heard me speak on this before, I like to joke about being the Sasquatch of compliance. People have seen Sasquatch, but they've seen pictures of Sasquatch, but nobody's actually met one. We see the same thing with having a single chief information governance officer run everything. What is more typical is you maybe have a director of information governance that has a liaison relationship with the litigation group, the e-discovery folks, with the storage administrators and application administrators and message administrators within IT, within compliance and risk management and privacy and information security, and or the business units. And that's a really important part of it. And so the great majority of times, and again, we work with 30% of the Fortune 500, many small organizations. We work with many, many different companies. Inevitably, we see some type of steering committee approach to getting this done because so many of these issues touch all these different departments. You know, you can't do defensible disposition without addressing legal holds. You can't do legal holds without talking about records management. We can't talk about securing information without talking to information security and IT and other groups like that. And so all these groups are sort of working together. And again, we have a good approach or a good steering. You know, you'll talk about that in future of this series, is how do you organize your IG or your information governance organization. That's going to be a future topic, but it's typically this group of organizations working together. And it does, can I just start the program myself? Well, you can be the catalyst for these types of programs, and some of our clients are really good practitioners of this, are really good at starting things up, but they're also really good at reaching out to these other groups, explaining, hey, if we work together on this, we're going to be more successful than if we try and do all of our own individual initiatives alone. For example, data mapping. I'll just give you one example. We see privacy people doing data mapping. We see the e-discovery people doing data mapping. We see records managers doing data mapping. We're seeing IT people do data mapping. We've gone to organizations that have had 4 separate data mapping initiatives all over the same data. Wouldn't it make sense if we could have one data map that we use for multiple purposes, and what you collect, we'll all take turns, we'll all work together collecting information, and it will serve multiple masters? Well, that takes some coordination. That takes being able to work with different groups and people. So think about who should be involved in your overall IG organization, and this is typically who we see is involved. We talked a little bit about this, getting rid of unneeded documents and data. This is often an emotional win. I know it is for the litigators. Most litigators say, God, we got too much stuff out there. Those involved in lawsuits. Privacy people, this is very good. be careful how you approach this to the business units. And this is going to sound crazy, but so often good defensible disposition projects can drive a tremendous amount of productivity for the business units. But you don't want to say, hey, guess up, everyone. Hey, I'm going to go around all the business units saying we're doing this massive document deletion project, because what that does is that creates this knee-jerk reaction right off the top where users are going to say, they're going to delete my stuff. I need it. I need to keep. And we'll talk about in this whole series how we be smarter about that. But it is important to point out that organizations have a huge amount of junk, of unneeded stuff that they can get rid of, but they need to do it in a smart way. They need to do it in a compliant way. They need to make sure that they don't delete records. They need to make sure they're respectful of legal holds. And we have to make sure that we can identify and retain and make accessible the high business value stuff and get rid of the stuff that nobody needs, nobody cares about. A big win for a lot of organizations, but we're seeing a lot of these information governance programs do defensible disposition. Although, again, we also see we get called into organizations a lot of times that had started defensible disposition programs and they stalled out, in part because they were thinking about just deleting and they didn't think about these other factors. And I keep on coming back to this point that these things are interconnected. We want an interconnected approach, because even though we want to get rid of stuff, sometimes it's hard to do that unless we work with other groups and we're smart in the overall approach that we want to take for it. Now, it's interesting. I alluded to this just a minute ago, which is, and people don't think about this. Sometimes organizations say, hey, let's do this thing called information governance, or maybe they don't call it information. Maybe they say, we're going to do an electronic data deletion project, or we're going to do an e-record project. And they're thinking, we want to do this because, quite frankly, we need to reduce the cost of litigation, or we need to be better compliant, or we have some privacy requirements. Well, those are all good things. I don't want to take any. Those are all really valid reasons for going out and starting something. But oftentimes, the most overlooked reason is this whole, remember we talked about the environment where this information is just piling up and piling up, the files and the emails, to some extent the structured data, even the paper documents are piling up. Sometimes employees have so much stuff they can't find anything. They have their own little silo, they can't share, they don't know the good content, they don't know, what's the right version of it. These are all big problems to be able to do that. So when we talk about information governance, one of the big drivers we allude to is the employee productivity. We have found significant increases in day-to-day employee productivity with a good information governance program in helping them identify and better manage and make more accessible high-value content information. And so, again, our warning is don't be careful when you're going out there looking at just one of these drivers. We want to think about what the messaging and the communication and our strategies, how do we present the program. But again, I had one of our clients that we were talking about all the drivers, and he stopped at this slide and he said, this is the money card. What do you mean? Well, this is the one that will win acceptance throughout the business. This is the one that will get the business units on board. And he was absolutely right. I mean, it wasn't a surprise to us, but absolutely right. So the employee productivity should be a big part of it, in part because they're drowning in their own information. By the way, this slide is made up of a bunch of comments from individual employees. These are actual interview comments that we've had, and these are not at all atypical. We go into organizations a lot and doing assessments for information governance, and they come back and say, well, the employees don't care about this, or the employees won't want to talk to you, or they don't have any opinion on this. And we said, well, let's just talk to them. We go talk to some of the business units. We talk about some of the employees, and this gushing about frustration. I can't find anything. Oh, I don't need what to do. What information should I have? All come rolling out of these employees. It's a huge issue for them. And so, again, it's a big driver within IG programs. All right. So sometimes, and I alluded to this earlier, we see fragmented approaches. We see an e-discovery or a shredding or a privacy or an IP management initiative. And these may go against a single media. Maybe it goes against files, or maybe they go against paper documents. And it's sort of the right idea, but what we have found is that these fragmented approaches don't work very well. Well, in part because there's different stakeholders. We alluded to that. I mean, there's one group that wants to do that, they're just trying to do it themselves. But also that the way that they operate, it's, in this example, there's 11 different initiatives on there. And by the way, we've seen more than that. If they're not coordinated, they're likely to conflict with each other. And the other thing is, it's really difficult for a company both to be able to fund and execute 11 different initiatives around the same area. More often than not, organizations are going to want a much smarter economy of scale to be able to do that. So we're seeing, again, we talk about information governance. This is one slide you're going to take home today, saying, what is an information governance program? One slide you take for the class, it may be this one saying, wow, we don't have to have all these different things. Maybe if we have one program that addresses these things, that will be easier than having 11 different programs to go after that. And that's sort of the light bulb that oftentimes goes on. Now, by the way, I should mention this. Sometimes we hear this saying, you know, Mark, you're saying great stuff, but you don't work in my organization. It's really, really hard to get other groups to work with us. And I appreciate that. I don't want to diminish the fact that sometimes building a consensus, building a joint approach is more difficult, in part because you may have individuals that say, oh, I don't want to work with them, or I just want to get my thing done, or I don't care about your thing. I mean, they don't say this, but what they mean to say is, I don't care about your thing, I just want to do my thing. But we also find that it's much more cost effective, it's much more efficient, it's much more effective, and quite frankly, it's easier, much more likely, if we can sort of work together on a single program, or if it's not, maybe it's not a single program. Maybe it's just some common initiatives that are coordinated among different groups. I'm not saying that we all come together and do everything together, but maybe it's just a coordinated approach. That can work out well too. But again, I'll repeat, the fragmented approach, in our view, does not work very well. So let's get to the heart of the matter. What is, Mark, you talk about this thing called information governance. What is it? I mean, what do you actually do, or what do companies do, or other types of organizations? By the way, it's not just companies, it's state and local, it's federal governments, federal agencies. We're seeing just about everybody do these types of programs. What is in an information governance program? And I'm going to walk through this a little bit slowly, although by the way, the entire series will go through all of these we call this the bubble chart. We'll go through all these bubbles as we go through, because we'll explain it. So if you don't understand everything we're talking about now, we will talk about this in future classes. First one is, a lot of organizations are taking a big picture view. They're taking an assessment and a roadmap. Where are we at today? How well are we managing our paper? How well are we managing our electronic? What are the legal requirements? What's our litigation profile? How well do our practices that we do today meet those requirements? How much is our information management or information governance activities helping or hurting employee productivity? Are we following the rules? There's a tendency sometimes to want to jump into these programs, but the very best programs sort of start out with this big picture view to begin with of a good assessment and roadmap. The next one is something that you may already have today, which is a records retention policy and schedule. But we're seeing a lot of organizations update their records retention policy and schedule to create a more modern, more compliant, something that is easier to execute, that addresses electronic, that's up to date with all the current regulations, that are doing the shift from a more paper-centric to a more electronic or media agnostic type of policy and schedule. And again, we'll talk about this in next class. So assessment is, where are we at? Policy and schedule is, what do we save and for how long? And then a privacy and security program, whether it's for GDPR or HIPAA data, or maybe it's just confidential information. Maybe you have corporate confidential intellectual property. Organizations are beginning to say, what data do we have? Where is it? How do we secure it? And how do we get rid of it? By the way, if you're paying close attention, you'll say, hold it. Records retention is about what documents and data do we have, what are records, how do we save them, and how do we get rid of them. Privacy and security oftentimes is about what privacy and sensitive information do we have, where is it, how do we secure it, and how do we get rid of it. Maybe we get some synergy between those two. That's exactly right, and we're seeing that. We're seeing organizations update their legal hold and discovery response program. They're getting that litigation ready. They're doing everything from data mapping to legal hold processes to other things out there to make that easier for them to be able to follow what they want. And so That's a big part of these programs too. We're seeing organizations doing something called a data placement strategy. Data placement is, where should your data live? It's in the wrong place right now. Where should it live? And hand in hand with that is figuring out, do we need new technology? Or maybe we've got technology. Maybe we see a lot of organizations deploying Office 365. It's probably one of the most significantly underused technologies out there. People are just dumping stuff in there when you could actually get a lot of the compliance stuff we're talking about, the litigation readiness, the better productivity, if smart about how you apply that technology, through the taxonomy and a file plan. So again, I'm going to just walk through this. Roadmap is where we're at. Policy and schedule is what we save. Privacy and security is what's sensitive information. How do we manage that? How do we get ready for either regulatory inquiry or litigation? Or how do we just get ready at reducing costs and risk? Where should our documents and data live? Do we have the right tools to be able to do that? By the way, how do we then set up these so they're really easy and intuitive to use? And there's a whole, and how we also have a full governance framework around that, because we've talked about records retention or privacy or other types of requirements. How do we govern our data all the way versus just part of the way? And then we get to areas like behavior change management, communications, and training. How do we get employees to stop doing the stuff we don't want them to and start following the right behaviors? And how do we make sure we audit that? And then I alluded to this. Okay, now we got all the stuff. How do we get rid of the old data? Legacy data disposition, and how do we then set up an organization to be able to manage all these processes? And so organizations will approach this type of programs a little bit differently. You know, they mix up the steps. Sometimes they already have the technology. Sometimes maybe they have a schedule or something else like that. But by and large, and again, we probably work with more organizations. Well, let's say this: we work with more organizations doing information governance than anybody else in the world. Almost all of them sort of kind of fall into this framework or this approach. The framework's not the right word. The approach to be able to do that. So again, what is it? This is oftentimes what we need. I have another question here. If you have a director to help facilitate those discussions, where do they ultimately report up to? IT. Oh, that's a good question. So I'm going to answer a question. We'll talk about this in the last class when we talk about creating your information governance organization. But I still want to be responsive to the question. Sometimes report into legal, sometimes report into IT. What we're typically finding now is maybe we'll have a director of information governance or manager of information governance that may report into one of those two groups, but their job is also to work with and liaise with the steering committee that has representatives from all the different organizations out there. And so it's going to vary from organization to organization. Usually when somebody wakes up every day and it's her or his job to worry about information governance, but also they typically have more of a steering committee type of role, and there's different types of steering committees, and there's an executive steering committee, and there's also a working steering committee, and there's coordinators. And I'll save a lot of that for our subsequent class that we go into that. I don't want to do that, but I do also want to make sure that out there. I have another question out there. If a records retention policy was never approved by the board, is it legal? Well, that's an interesting question. Let me put it a different way. Before you ever put pen to paper to create your policy, before your internal group ever approved a policy, and regardless of whether your organization has a policy and has it approved by their board of directors, you have legal and regulatory requirements around records that you have to maintain. And so those exist from day one. Whether you've codified those rules into a policy to show that you're consistent is sort of secondary. The rules still exist. Matter of fact, if you don't have a policy, you're not off the hook. You're actually in bigger trouble because for a number of different reasons around litigation and e-discovery, and also from compliance perspective, you are going to be in more trouble not having a policy, or not having a policy, or having a policy you don't follow than having a policy you follow. So, it's a good question, but your responsibilities are out there regardless of where you're having the policy. What we want to do is codify that in a single policy, show that we're following it, we're doing best faith, and we're testing against it, and that we're being responsible. That is what makes compliance. We have another question here. Is your office is already implementing Office 365? How do you write the ship to include better IG? Boy, that's a good question. We're going to talk about, I'm going to I'm going to defer that one a little bit when we go out to our data placement. We have one of the classes coming up. Is good questions for this class and future classes, by the way. There are a number of different strategies to be able to do that, but basically we want to push the fact that we want better productivity, that the business units want better collaboration. We can make them more effective if we help identify the right information and set up governance appropriately in that. And or you can talk about privacy requirements and or get the litigators on board to say we need to be smart about this. It's this whole steering committee approach is you get more stakeholders bought into your program that helps guide your organization to do things the right way, like setting up Office 365. And what the student is referring to is sometimes people deploy Office 365 where they just take all their files on their disk and then throw them up into the cloud. And you can do it that way. You can just pile everything on Office 365. It's a little cheaper, but you're not really helping the business as much. All right, so we've talked about what's involved in IG. Let me just give you I'm going to go through some examples right now. So health insurance carrier, 5,000 employees, lots of regulatory requirements. They found information burdensome, and so what they did is that they went through workshop review, they went through classification offices, they developed a really good email file plan, they had an up-to-date records retention schedule. They were able to get rid of 45 million emails, and which is impressive because that reduced cost, that reduced risk. Some of that was privacy related. I mean, all these good things. But the thing that made it a really good information governance program is because they did this thing called behavior change management, which we'll talk about. They were able to delete 45 million emails with 0 employee complaints. And so the point I'm trying to make here is we're seeing here's just one aspect of an IG program. In this case, it was a combination of records management, defensible disposition. They had some technology involved and employee behavior change management. And they had a really good result out there by putting these pieces together. And they could really draw some real business benefits associated with that. Okay, so I want to, again, start talking turkey. I want to understand I want to be able to, hopefully I understand, but I want to be able to elucidate okay, maybe you're going to your CFO and maybe she's asking, why do we need to do an IG program? I mean, don't we already have a records program? What do we get out of that? This is where, when we talk about information governance, even though they're sophisticated programs, we want to keep them simple. When we talk about the benefits of these, don't use the legal gobbledygook. Or the definition. Say, hey, we can manage records better. Today, we only have, in this example, 65% of our records properly managed. Yeah, that's a compliance risk for us. What we want to do is get to the state where we get the vast majority of our records, both paper and especially electronic, better management of records. So we get those managed. How they get that. Hey, today we have lots of sensitive information. We have either privacy or IP or pick your favorite type of sensitive information. And by the way, when I talk about sensitive information, it could include privacy or IP or trade secrets or health-related information. That's a subset of privacy. Many different types of sensitive information, but many of the strategies for managing this information are similar. Not exactly the same, but many similar strategies for doing that. Hey, we have a lot of sensitive information out there. We want to be smart about, quite frankly, making sure that's better managed, because today we have so much unmanaged privacy information. If somebody were to come into our file share and look at our file share, we could have a huge breach. We want to get a much higher percentage of our sensitive information better managed. Well, that makes sense. Hey, we want to get rid of stuff. And again, this is the emotional win for especially the litigators out there. We think we can delete 65% of our unstructured data. Remember, we talked about that being files and stuff like that. Of our semi-structured data, we talked about that being email and connected imaging systems, other things like that. Most of our paper, and matter of fact, we can actually cut back a lot of our database data. Just the fact that you're doing disposition, if you can actually do that, we gave the last example of that could be seen as a big win. Or another win is what we call prototypical e-discovery. Maybe your organization had a mid-sized lawsuit, and maybe it spent $2 million on it. This is not at all, this is very typical results. Maybe after you do an information governance program and you have the same type of lawsuit, you'd spend half as much on discovery. or less. That's not. We've seen organizations save huge amounts. Now, we don't know what lawsuits are coming up, but we know it's likely we will. And boy, we could save a lot of money and reduce risk. So, and then finally, employees today spend 6 hours per week searching for documents. We think under this new program they could save 3 hours per week. By the way, this is all data points taken from actual organizations of information governance. This is not. This is actual data points we're using out here. We measured employee productivity, and we measured the fact that we've been able to save 3 hours per week per employee. That's a huge win, especially in a big organization. Huge win. But again, notice how when we talk about information governance, we're trying to make it as plain spoken as possible. We're trying to just use English. I'm trying to avoid the legalese or the technicalese or other stuff like that. Couching your terms in those, couching your description in those terms doesn't help you. By the way, there are a bunch of other non-obvious areas that an information governance program can help organizations. One is employee innovation. Not only can we make individual employees more productive, we can make groups of employees or cross-department collaboration much more productive. And we've seen organizations that have, quite frankly, been much better at employee innovation, in part because they just did a real simple step of making their information more accessible. Big issue in mergers and acquisitions and divestitures. If you're buying somebody or you're selling a division or stuff like that, whose organization is where and who's got what and how do we separate that? A good information governance program can facilitate that tremendously. Matter of fact, it can accelerate the integration of an acquisition by a tremendous amount, and we've seen that. And so we've seen M&A as a big part of IG programs. Another issue is impact of employee turnover. We can see that organizations have lots of employee turnover. Sometimes, if somebody leaves or retires, their information goes with them. What can we do to share? Or even something simple like BYOD devices. Having a good information governance program can help solve this issue. Now, I'm going to go through this a little bit. This is a little bit slightly more advanced topic, but I just wanted to allude to that, which is what is the return on investment? If we spend money, how much money are we going to save on these programs? And we find an ROI on storage savings. We find an ROI on reducing cost and risk of e-discovery. I just alluded to that. We also, quite frankly, if we just do better, we may not have fines. And this, by the way, could become a huge issue in the world of European privacy or in California Consumer Privacy Act. Huge potential financial penalties. So if we have better programs, we can reduce the likelihood in the future we're going to have these types of fines, or as I said, just there's a good ROI associated with making employees more productive. And again, here's just an actual ROI that we did for an organization where we took all these different factors and put them all together. The reason we do this is sometimes CFOs and GCs want to see hard numbers, and we can produce hard numbers. We think that these programs save money and reduce costs in a number of different ways. And here's an example of an organization where we actually went through and did that, be able to do that. And again, we've got some other good case studies on our website that talk about good ROI. We could talk a very long time around that. But again, I'm trying to keep this as an intro. I'm trying to give you a feel today for why are organizations doing this and what are they trying to do. Okay, so what types of organizations are starting? All types. We're seeing global manufacturers. I'm seeing mid-sized insurance carriers. I'm seeing regional transit agencies. I'm seeing banks. I'm seeing life sciences companies. I'm seeing state and local government. I'm seeing retail. I'm seeing consumer packaged goods. It used to be that we saw this in a few industries. We are seeing all different companies, public, private, public sector, commercial. Big companies, little companies. We have some clients that have 75 employees. We've got some clients that are doing IG programs that have 275,000 employees, all over the board. And the reason is they want to get smarter, more cost-effective, more productive in terms of reducing risk around how they manage information. So the reason I want to present this is to say, well, people aren't doing this in my industry. Well, actually, yeah, they probably are. And this wasn't true, but really within the last year, 18 months, we've seen some of the industries like global manufacturing. Global manufacturing, we didn't see too much around IG 2 years ago, but within the last 2 years, I've seen, quite frankly, a rush of global manufacturing to do information governance programs. Here's the federal agencies. They had another case study: ongoing accumulation of files and emails. They updated clearer policies. They had a better place to put stuff. They did employer behavior change management. Huge savings through defensible disposition. Huge increase in productivity. Much higher compliance. And this is a big deal for some federal agencies. So sometimes we hear, well, we're different. We have different rules. Yes, federal agency may have different legal requirements than a publicly traded corporation. I get that. But believe it or not, the practices and approaches between the two may be very similar, and quite frankly, the benefits may be similar too. So we're seeing lots of organizations that are sort of doing these types of IG programs. Okay, so how to get started? Educate yourself on the needs and benefits of an information governance committee. We talked about that. Educate yourself on information governance, and if you're an attendee in this class, you're obviously taking that step. Create alliance with other stakeholders. Think about how you meet out with those other stakeholders. Start forming a steering committee. And again, there may be a temptation to say, I'm just going to try and do this myself. And you may want to be the catalyst that starts it, but our experience is try and reach out saying, hey, and when you talk to them, what's the win for them? And maybe you're in records manager. We want better records management. Well, I don't care about that. Well, what's the win for the stakeholder you're trying to engage? Maybe it's productivity. Maybe it's better compliance on privacy. Maybe it's reduced risk and cost in this area. But think about it, and there's a win for everybody. Put together a roadmap and then really think about going to the senior management as a group, saying, okay, we've got this idea initiative. We're going to break it down into pieces. We're going to launch it. We're working together. These are the typical steps we see of organizations to start this. Go through some process of this to getting a program started. And so many of you probably have to do that. As you build support with senior management, go as a team. I keep on alluding to describe program in plain spoken terms. Don't use the gibberish because they won't get you anywhere. And again, the more plain spoken you can talk about the issues in your environment, in your industry, the better. Connect them with overall corporate initiatives. Hey, we want to save costs this year. We want to make employees more productive. Those are big. Do it in pieces. Self-serving comment, but true. But bring in outside validation. We do a lot of times. We're brought in to help validate a program or help them build one or talk about what the peers are doing. We talked about return on investment. Sometimes benchmarking against peers is the most effective way. And then show some quick wins. I mean, these are just some overall strategies. We're going to touch on many of these points throughout this whole class series. But remember these points. These are winning strategies. We've seen companies do this, take these winning strategies. Life sciences company, another example. Lots of unstructured data and emails out there. Increase in discovery costs out there. They updated the schedule, got litigation readiness. They had defensible disposition. Again, much better collaboration, accelerated integration of acquired companies. So they did a lot of M&A, much better, reduced cost. And the big thing was employee innovation. They use this as an underpinning for driving their employee innovation program. Completely different than the federal agency we talked before. Completely different than maybe the global manufacturing I talked about before. But the same kind of wins. And again, some of these wins are highlighted for this one. For them, the win was in employee innovation and reducing e-discovery risk. But again, there's lots of benefits with these programs. So let's go to some of the take-home points. We're in class. Write these down for no, it's not really a final. But if there were a final, information governance is applying a set of standard policies, process, technologies. And again, it's really a whole program approach. Think about the program and think about the legal, the records, the private sensitive information. Think about defensible disposition, litigation readiness, employee productivity. All this stuff adding up, accumulation of paper and electronic. If you just let it sit, it's going to get worse. Organizations need to put programs together. We talked about how these programs are best driven by multiple stakeholders. When done well, they make money or they create savings. They do. We've seen it. And it's important to communicate the value of these programs early to senior leadership. Let them know why you're doing and what you're trying to do and explain it clearly. So some things to think about IG. And again, have confidence that if you talk about these programs these ways, that you're going to be correct. Again, I talk to more CFOs, general counsel, CEOs about information governance than just about lots. It's been a better part of my week doing it. And I know that if you talk about this way, it will be work. I don't feel obligated to bring out my dictionary full of fancy terms or definitions because that doesn't sway them. And so those types of approaches work. I have time for some questions, more questions, but real briefly about Contoro. We're the largest independent provider. We don't sell any products or store any documents or do any reactive e-discovery. We have the cross-functional team. We do everything associated with these programs, everything from policy to technology to employee behavior change management. We work with more than 30% of the Fortune 500. We work with many companies across nearly all industries, very senior people. And again, our whole approach as consultants, and we're a pure consulting firm, is to help organizations have a real impact on the business. And you can see from what we're talking about. We have some really good info packs out here. This is sort of an advanced study. We make this available to practitioners, to attendees of this class. We have an info pack. This is something we created for the Association for Corporate Counsel. It's a very long read. I know because I wrote it, and it took me a very long time to write. It's a very long read that will talk about many of the elements I talked about, drills down on ROI, records policies, many different aspects of it. Send us an email. Happy to send you as an attendee of this class, this info pack. Next class is, we alluded to this, is Modern Records and Information Management. Talk about what that is. And as you can see, if you're signed up for this, you'll be invited to all the other classes that we have out there. Really good topics, and again, we endeavor to make this as clear as possible. And by the way, we are just announcing today, we got a little sneaky class in there. We have this is only 30 minutes. We think that almost every company in the U.S. is going to be affected by the California Consumer Privacy Act, because while affecting California consumers now, we think it's going to affect all consumers in the U.S. and all employees in the U.S. in the not too distant future, or nearly all of them. And so we have a number of quick classes. Go to the website at Contoro, www.contoro.com, or we'll send you an email for the invite. So if you want to sneak in an extra, this is going to be a quickie overview of what you need to do about CCPA. Big interview, four 30-minute sections that we go through. And so with that, we have some time for questions as we go through. I've got one question here. You talked about who pays for a program, or I get the question wrong. You talk about program reports to, who typically pays for this. That's a great question. It varies. Sometimes we have different departments pay for different groups. IT will pay for this, or legal will pay for the policy. A lot of times, quite frankly, when they get together as an initiative, they can sometimes get their own funding associated with this. Making a credible business argument on how you do that, we see management oftentimes will want to invest that. Sometimes they connect this to a board initiative. We had one client that was very concerned about data security. They worried about control of their IP. And so the board of directors basically said, we need to do this. So they got some additional funding from the board of directors to be able to do that. So a big area there. I think I have time for one more question. We have a retention policy, but system owners of structured systems don't dispose of the data that's meant retention. What is the best way to compel your business to take action? Risk has not worked, neither has cost of storage. Well, for structured data, it's trickier. We have a whole webinar on managing data and records in structured systems on our website. But let me see if I can get you the answer to that. Oftentimes, the record retention requirement is a minimum record retention requirement. We see the big issue is that oftentimes organizations will be taking copies of this data and putting it in a data warehouse or something else like that. We don't think that your argument here is really around record retention. We think the argument on being smarter about saving the right information is around risk for e-discovery, because you can have to discover against both these structured systems, especially against the data warehouse. And a huge issue is the privacy rules coming up, because many of these privacy rules have a requirement for right to be forgotten or right to be erasure. And if your databases are saving your customers' personal information, and some of them are either European citizens and today California consumers, you are creating a huge risk on there. So take a look at our California Consumer Privacy Act webinar. We'll talk about that, or we've got some other things on there. But don't bark up the records management tree. Try and look at some of these other things. Okay, One last question. When you're talking program, are you talking procedures versus software? We're talking program. We're talking about a combination of policies, processes, technology, training, audit. It's sort of all the above. It's not yes, there are software technology programs that are part of this, but we're talking about putting together all of these elements to make an entire initiative or an entire program. So with that, we're done with class today. We appreciate you coming and joining us. Thank you very much. We appreciate all your questions. We look forward to seeing you at our next class. Please make sure you answer our comments. We want to make sure it was as useful for you. And good luck as you start or run your information governance program.